Hey everyone, my name is Paul and I'm a student at Rice, and what I want to do in this video is it's not to go after Professor Dave or Dave Farina, it's not to go after Dr. James Tour or to even give a defense of any of them, but instead to explain why I think Dave Farina is misunderstanding and as a result misrepresenting James Tour's critiques of origin of life research, of abiogenesis, of these sorts of things. So let's go ahead and get started. So one of the reasons I wanted to make this video, so I'm a student at Rice. I did my undergraduate at Rice and now I'm going for a PhD. And it's not a PhD in chemistry, so I'm not going to be talking about chemistry. Instead, I'm going to be talking about philosophy of science and how their back and forth has related to philosophy of science. And I want to start by saying I used to not have a good view of Dr. Tour. I used to have a similar view of Dr. Tour to the one Farina has. This is before I even knew who Professor Dave was. I bought into this depiction of him as a religious fundamentalist who prioritized sort of converting students over teaching them chemistry. I'd heard these rumors, oh, Dr. Tour puts Bible verses on his tests and is loud and belligerent in these things. And then I saw Professor Dave's videos and I thought this was even more the case. And I'm like, okay, I don't know. Dr. Tour knows what he's talking about when it comes to these things. He's just lying for Jesus or whatever it is. But this all actually changed when I went to a talk by Dr. Tour. And I figured, okay, Dr. Tour is giving this talk, I might as well go, and maybe I won't be afraid to ask any what I would consider juicy questions, but I'll go anyway. And going to this talk actually changed my view of Dr. Tour a lot. I actually asked him some specific questions at this talk. This talk's on YouTube. You can actually hear me asking him these questions. And he didn't mention God. He didn't mention God of the gaps or anything like that. And I actually began to share his concern that the public is misled about origin of life research, and it's discouraging people to going into this field. And I'll tell you a little bit more about this in a little bit. But the main thing was I specifically asked him if he was ruling out or trying to rule out a naturalistic process for the origin of life. And he said, no. He said, look, I would never do that. I'd never say that. I'm just saying right now, we don't know. There's a lot we don't know. And I'm trying to point out that I think science communication is overblowing these claims. And as a result, I started to agree with him. And we'll talk about this in a second. My concern here is that I think Professor Dave, I think what's going on here is he's so used to arguing against young earth creationists and others that he's actually putting words in Dr. Tour's mouth and thinking he's believing things that he doesn't, or thinking he's making claims that he doesn't. Well, because the alternative is Professor Dave knows Dr. Tour doesn't believe these things, but is saying them anyway. So I don't want to assume poor intention, so instead assuming ignorance here. Here's the thing, Tour's religious views are irrelevant to his critiques of origin of life. We'll talk a little bit about more in this in a minute, but that's the whole value of science. The whole value of science is that we're focusing on the issues in the data and not on personal beliefs. They were relevant. Here's the thing. Then I'm assuming Dave's a naturalist, but his presumably naturalistic views could also cloud his judgment. One could argue, okay, let's just assume for a second that a non-natural basis for life is true. Let's just assume there's this entity called God who put together molecules to create life, right? If that was actually true, one could say, hey, look, Dave, you're not able to consider the evidence and follow it where it leads either. So any of these sorts of critiques about one's personal belief are off the table. That's why there's methodological naturalism in science, where we put all those beliefs away and we focus on the data itself. The other thing I want to say, I've talked to many Christians who think God could have used natural processes to create life, and it wouldn't necessarily be undermined by there being a naturalistic explanation. For instance, I think if somebody sat down Dr. Tour and said, hey, look, we came up with this new chemistry and we're able to show that actually the emergence of life is highly probable under these conditions of an early Earth. I think Dr. Tour would be like, okay, great. That's great. We didn't know that, and now we know it. Doesn't falsify Christianity, doesn't change anything about anything, really. Maybe it would cause some people to need to reinterpret Genesis, but I don't think that necessarily it doesn't falsify anything about Christianity per se. I don't think Dr. Tour would necessarily be against this. Of course, maybe he'd be skeptical. He'd be like, wait a minute, we've been doing this for so long, and now all of a sudden we magically come up with this new thing. But hey, that's the case. Here's the thing. Professor Dave offers a lot of these claims about Dr. Tour, and I think these aren't things that Dr. Tour has ever said or even believes himself. Some of the things. Professor Dave says, there's no evidence that these events require the intervention of a deity. That's fine. I've never seen Tour claim that a deity had to have done it. If Tour was saying, look, it had to have been God because we've ruled out naturalistic processes, and said, look, this is a scientific explanation, he would rightly be criticized as stepping outside of science and into philosophy. Now, the claim that that there had to have been an entity like God, or that under naturalism, abiogenesis is highly improbable, that's a philosophical claim, and one that actually, in philosophical circles, isn't completely debunked. I mean, there are a lot of very high-profile academics in the field of philosophy who, because of the state of origin of life, and particularly abiogenesis, they think it's so improbable that they think that there had to have been something, not necessarily God, but maybe some sort of natural teleology. These are people like Thomas Nagel, Antony Flew, who actually became a deist. He was an atheist for a long time in his life. So these are philosophers, but these aren't scientists, because once again, these aren't scientific explanations. Doesn't mean they're invalid, doesn't mean they're false per se, it just means they're not falsifiable. Other things that he's saying. Oh, look, if someone feels the need to invoke a deity in explaining the origin of life, such that a god must have wiggled his nose and coaxed some molecules in the same vicinity to kickstart the process, they can do so. They can pretend a deity helped them find their keys in the morning if they want to. These aren't Dr. Tour's views. He's never said this. I've never heard him say, oh, God had to have done it. We don't know, therefore God. Same thing about God of the Gaps. Here's another quote from Professor Dave. Oh, if we want to invoke God of the Gaps, here it is. I've never heard Dr. Tour give a God of the Gaps argument. Well, let's look at a few more Professor Dave's claims. The reasoning behind his stance on abiogenesis is clearly religiously motivated. It is not clear. It is not clear why this is the case. It could be the case that his criticisms on abiogenesis is motivated by his experience as a synthetic organic chemist. This is the claim Dave Farina is making. He bears the burden of proof of showing that it is precisely Dr. Tour's religious views and not any of his other views. And that's a very difficult thing. And once again, this is not a scientific explanation because it can't be falsified. What are you going to do? Copy Dr. Tour and make several copies and present one with, create a non-religious version and then see if he has the same critiques of origin of life? Once again, this is not how scientific debates are resolved. And I don't even think his critiques about the fact that we don't know what we know, this is echoed by other people in the origin of life community. And that's irrespective of their religious views. The other thing is, Professor Dave can't claim that Tour's criticism of origin of life is religiously motivated because he claims that we don't know anything about it, because that would be arguing in a circle. That's actually begging the question. He's presupposing Tour's views are wrong to try to explain why he holds them. So it just that criticism doesn't work. Obviously, Dr. Tour is able to do great chemistry, which even Farina, Professor Dave is going to say. So why would his views on abiogenesis as a synthetic organic chemist be a priori invalid? This is the difficulty, right? Saying, okay, Dr. Tour is obviously able to do great chemistry, but when it's his chemistry views on origin of life, what's the difference there? Why? Is it because they somehow contradict scripture? Maybe, but it's unclear that that's the reason why Dr. Tour is voicing the criticisms he does. Also, saying that Dr. Tour contradicts scientific mainstream is not a good reason for a priori denouncing his views. I mean, consider Galileo. At the time of Galileo, everyone thought that the Earth was the center of the universe and the sun revolved around the Earth. And this had nothing to do with the Bible either. It had to do with Aristotle, the Aristotelian view of the cosmos and the Earth at the center. Galileo showed that, look, all these people, all the scientific mainstream and the scientists at the time were wrong. And that's why Galileo has this quote, all it takes is one person and one experiment to show that any number of people are wrong and it can be overturned. So once again, the fact that Dr. Tour is not appealing to scientific mainstream isn't a reason to distrust his views about origin of life. That's why we need to look at the views themselves and evaluate them on their own merits, not based on who's saying it. Once again, so many statements. Tour differs in that he doesn't outwardly state that scripture supersedes empiricism, but it is quite apparent that this is what is happening in his mind regardless. He just won't admit it, probably not even to himself. This is what Dave Farina says. It is not, it's not apparent, and all of a sudden, Dave Farina, Professor Dave, is claiming he's a better epistemic authority on Dr. Tour's psychology than Dr. Tour himself. This is where it gets to be difficult. Dr. Tour continually states that he believes his religion plays no part in his scientific work. Obviously, there are great Christians and great atheists and great agnostics and great Muslims that are all able to do wonderful scientific research. So if Dr. Tour is unable to do good scientific work because of his religious views, and that's the claim that Professor Dave is making, he needs to provide evidence for this claim, and I'm going to argue he hasn't done it yet. Other claims that he says, look, Jim's religious views are informing his scientific stance. It's not clear. This is all you need to understand people like Dr. Tour. Fear of mortality, a desire to go to heaven and live eternally. These are fundamental instinctual driving forces that can overpower the psyche of even a brilliant, rational scientist. It's unclear that this is what's going on, and this is driving Dr. Tour's criticisms of origin of life. The claim that abiogenesis forces him to reconsider the tenets of his faith, I don't see how this is the case. I don't see how this is the case at all. And this commits what we call the genetic fallacy, which is assuming that because one can explain where a belief comes from, it's therefore false, and that's without addressing the actual content of the belief itself. That's why we need to look at the content of what Dr. Tour is saying and not any of these sort of psychoanalytic accounts of them. Professor Dave says, look, then there's Jim's God, one who created the universe with a vague plan, and then finding out that not much was happening, had to step in a second time to figure out how to make enantiomerically pure building blocks, physically nudge them together to polymerize, and then decide what magic powder to sprinkle in there to make it alive. I've never heard Dr. Tour offer this as an explanation. I've never heard him necessarily imply this is an issue. I just don't get it. I don't get where this is coming from. And my concern is that Professor Dave is assuming this is what Dr. Tour thinks when he's not actually offering that as an explanation. And of course, if Professor Dave wants to make this claim, he needs to show where Tour actually says this or where he cite where he says this. Because here's the thing, right? Dr. Tour does say on his website, look, I believe God created all this stuff. I believe God created the heavens and the earth, all these sorts of things, right? But none of that necessarily says that, God could have done it using a naturalistic process. God could have just set the universe in motion and it just happened, and God just set up the cosmos in that particular way. So none of these are necessarily falsified by abiogenesis happening naturalistically. So it's unclear if that's the case that Professor Dave is correct in assuming that Dr. Tour's religious views are the reasons behind his critiques. But maybe he says that in another video. I don't know. I haven't seen them all. And then here's the question. Here's the question I would have liked to ask Professor Dave at the debate. Dr. Tour showed this slide at one of his talks. 36.8% of the population, including college-educated people, said that under simulations of Earth's early atmosphere, scientists have mixed molecules together in laboratories to produce complex life forms such as frogs. Obviously, that hasn't happened. And 67.8% of the population thought that scientists have mixed molecules together in laboratories to produce single-celled life forms like bacteria. Also false. And I wonder, let's say maybe he wouldn't use the word clueless. Maybe he wouldn't agree with some of the actual chemistry parts. But would Professor agree with this study, that this is problematic, that more than half of the population thinks scientists have done things that they haven't actually done, and that this is discouraging people from going into a field that we need more researchers in order to actually solve these problems in the first place? So this is where I actually understand Dr. Tour's criticisms of origin of life communication, and where I'd agree with him on this. Look, if this is where the public thinks we are, and we're actually here, this gap needs to be explained somehow, and this gap is problematic. We want to be not making too grandiose claims, and we don't want to be underselling our claims either. We want to be accurate and honest with the public to protect the integrity of scientific communication. And then we have the debate, which I was disappointed by. In particular, kind of turned into this very polemic shouting match. But my main question is, why did Professor Dave attack Dr. Tour ad hominem? Either he couldn't address the science, and that's why he went after Dr. Tour personally, or he could address the science, but chose not to, at least not the whole time. Then you got to ask the question, but why? Why not focus on the science when you could? And I'd argue here at a university setting, it's embarrassing for someone claiming to be a science educator to not focus on the research. Now look, I'm not claiming Professor Dave needed to go up to the board and try to write out the chemical equations or these sorts of things. But I would have appreciated a more substantive discussion on the research and where they disagree, and not name calling and not shouting and these sorts of things. What if people walked away from this debate thinking this is what abiogenesis had to offer? What about all the students in the middle? And we'll look at what students came away from this debate doing. Once again, the main problem here is this is showing students a poor illustration of how science communication is actually done and how scientists resolve debates. It's not by calling each other liars and frauds. It's by looking at the data and debating the data and defining terms and then letting the data speak for itself. And here's the thing, right? There are places Professor Dave could have pushed back on. I just wish he did. And I was disappointed that the debate didn't actually focus as much on chemistry as it did on character attacks. Here's the thing. I think Professor Dave has great content and has great explanations on his channel. But as a science educator myself, and I know he's a science educator too, my concern is that he's actually misrepresenting the way research is done. I'm not saying he's misrepresenting the research itself, but by going on and calling people names and saying that they're wrong rather than focusing on the critiques themselves, this is giving students a poor picture of how scientists actually resolve disputes and do research in a professional academic setting. Although I will admit, calling someone willfully ignorant twat waffle is pretty funny, but here's the thing. These sorts of quotes, these sorts of things are why I no longer take any of Professor Dave's accusations about tours seriously anymore. It makes him look like a sophist rather than a serious scientist. And this is really the main issue. It's not that he could be right or wrong. It's just that it's kind of like the boy who cried wolf. He's going to call people who disagree with them all of these names, and then it makes his accusations about Dr. Tour just seem vacuous. And I'm not alone here. Somebody on Rice's social media called Fizz basically says, "Oh, I still can't believe Dr. Tour started beef with the YouTuber." And then someone replied, "Well, look, Farina called him a liar and a fraud, and those are videos that have millions of views. Those are serious accusations. If it was me, I would have responded." And then some other student, it wasn't me, was saying, "Look, a lot of us, including me, also defaulted to believing Dave and never gave Tour a chance." And they seems like they believed him because of the rhetoric, not because of the arguments themselves. And that's why we need to be looking beyond this rhetoric and beyond calling people names and looking at the research itself. Here's the thing. Fraudulence and dishonesty are serious claims, and we can't focus on this rhetoric. We need to be focusing on the science itself. Dr. Tour, at least in his debate, never appealed to Professor Dave's academic credentials or lack of citations in his field, even though Professor Dave went after Dr. Tour saying, "Look, you don't have any publications in Origin of Life." Dr. Tour could have just as easily been like, "Look, you don't have any publications in chemistry. What basis does that give you to attack my critiques of Origin of Life?" Doesn't move the conversation forward, and it doesn't focus on the research. Armchair psychoanalysis and allegations of dishonesty are not the way scientists resolve disputes. And this is hopefully what separates science from other fields. What gives science an epistemic authority over other fields is that it's able to focus objectively on data. But as soon as we start name calling, as soon as we start attacking character, we're no longer doing science and we're just throwing mud. Here's the other thing, and this has nothing to do with Professor Dave. A PhD is a doctorate in philosophy, and a PhD in science means a doctorate of philosophy in science, meaning you're including the methodology of science. A PhD shows you understand the methodology of how science is done and why scientific methodology is a good way of coming to truths about the world. This is why I think a PhD is so important, because it's not just, oh, you know a bunch of stuff and we give you a PhD. You actually have to demonstrate that you know how to do research. You know the process of doing research. And hopefully, and part of that is believing that the process of considering different views and testing them is a valuable thing. And this is why I think this back and forth between Professor Dave and Dr. Tour is misrepresenting the actual methodology of science. And that's why I think it's very problematic. And I'm not alone here. There are a lot of students at Rice who also think the same thing. Most students at Rice thought that Professor Dave was going to win the debate, but a majority of them, by about a 5-to-1 ratio, thought that Dr. Tour won the debate. Unfortunately, I don't think any of these people were persuaded by the actual research itself. Instead, I think they looked at Professor Dave's character and came to a judgment about the result of who won the debate because they thought, Professor Dave was mean or was a jerk or something. None of that would invalidate any of Professor Dave's points about abiogenesis, and none of it would invalidate Dr. Tour's points. But once again, we need to be in a place where we're able to make these judgments based on the data and not based on the accusations. Dr. Tour's religious beliefs are irrelevant to his criticisms of Origin of Life. If they were, Professor Dave would have to show that they are relevant in a non-circular way, which he hasn't done yet. Dr. Tour could believe life was created by unicorns who just shot rainbows out of their horns that came about and synthesized a first cell. That still wouldn't invalidate any of his scientific critiques about Origin of Life. And the way to discount his scientific critiques would be to focus and show that they're scientifically irrelevant or they're false, not by saying, oh, he's a liar, or this is what his religious presuppositions are. None of that would falsify any of this. The other thing, Professor Dave claims Dr. Tour's audience doesn't know enough about chemistry to comment. But if that's the case, then they don't know enough about chemistry to be believing him that Dr. Tour is a liar. So in that case, really the point is they need to go and learn the chemistry. And hopefully Professor Dave and Dr. Tour are teaching people chemistry so they know enough to actually make their own informed decision independent of the name calling and all these sorts of things. Now here's a spicy take, right? We care a lot about science and science education and science communication and who's undermining science. And I want to make the claim that scientists who claim to represent science communication but do a poor job at philosophy and philosophy of science are the main ones undermining science and scientific credibility. When people see scientists going out and being poor philosophers, that's what Einstein said, the man of science is a poor philosopher, who don't understand logic and are using these poor fallacious arguments, people are rightly going to think that science has nothing to offer. And I think they'd be justified in pragmatically walking away and saying, these people claim to be representing science, but they're not doing anything different. They don't have any authority. There's nothing about science that's any different than just throwing mud on social media, and they'd be right at walking away from this. So it's the people that do a poor job demonstrating how science is done that are actually undermining scientific authority. It's not people that are young earth creationists. It's not any of these other people. Let me give you an example. Intelligent design, or ID. I used to not take intelligent design seriously, but after looking at all these debates and looking at the behavior of those claiming that intelligent design has nothing to offer, it makes me think those arguing against it are misrepresenting it as well. If intelligent design is unscientific, why is it that the people who are arguing for intelligent design seeming to be behaving more scientifically than those who are attacking it? Why does it seem like those who are claiming that the people who are arguing about intelligent design have an agenda? Why does it seem like those are the people that also have an agenda as to why they don't like it in the first place? That's where this sort of thing cuts both ways. It's precisely the behavior of those who attack intelligent design that make me and others think it may have some merit, because their attacks are not going around with scientific methodology. Here's the conclusion. Professor Dave is saying, look, those who say, I don't know, therefore God, would do themselves a service by stopping after I don't know and learning how to cope with uncertainty. And I'm going to paraphrase Dr. Tour and say, I think what he would like to say is, look, those who think I don't know, therefore X process would do themselves a service by stopping after I don't know and learning how to cope with uncertainty. And those in the philosophy of science are going to say, look, those who think I don't know, therefore naturalism would do themselves a service by stopping after I don't know and learning how to cope with uncertainty, rather than appealing to a sort of naturalism of the gaps, that science is going to all of a sudden explain this and that. That gets into scientism, or the idea that because science has had so much success under scientific things, it's all of a sudden going to tell us all sorts of things about how we ought to live and these sorts of moral claims and all sorts of other things. That's a fallacious argument because it commits a category error. Science cannot tell us anything about morality, and it certainly hasn't done so yet. Even if it can tell us the origin of our moral beliefs and give us ideas about the content of our moral beliefs, descriptive claims, it's not able to offer us prescriptive claims. In the end, here's the thing. I have nothing against Professor Dave, and I think he makes great content when he focuses on the science itself and not the character of the people he's attacking. But I no longer take his accusations about anyone seriously anymore because of the way he's disagreed with other people, and I no longer think his accusations about Dr. Tour hold any weight. As a result, I probably won't be watching much from his channel because I don't think it's worth my time. It's not to say that proves he's wrong or anything, but it's just to say I don't think he's offered any substantive critiques of Dr. Tour, and I think he's actually misrepresenting his views because he hasn't sat down and listened to what Dr. Tour's critiques are saying. I think what he's doing is he's painting all these people in with a broad brush that, they all believe this, therefore they're wrong, without giving us good reasons to think that they're wrong, and without focusing on the research and doing the legwork to show that they're wrong. Anyway, my time is valuable to me, and I can do what I want. I can choose to watch whatever videos I want. I want to thank you for taking the time to watching my video, and let me know if you have any thoughts in the comments. See ya.